The engines of my B-25 Mitchell bomber screamed against the howling Pacific wind as I gripped the controls, feeling the carrier deck rolling beneath us like a living thing. 600 miles from Japan, the USS Hornet pitched and yacht in the heavy seas, her massive flight deck suddenly seeming no bigger than a postage stamp. Through the rain-streaked windscreen, I could see the angry gray waters rushing past at 30 knots, white foam exploding over the bow. In 12 minutes, I would attempt something that had never been done before: launch a twin-engine Army bomber from the deck of a Navy carrier, fly it straight into the heart of the Japanese Empire, and somehow live to tell about it. My name is Lieutenant Jack Morrison, and this is the story of how 16 Army Air Force crews aboard the USS Hornet changed the course of World War II on April 18, 1942. 4 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, and America was hungry for revenge. The Japanese seemed unstoppable. Wake Island had fallen, the Philippines were crumbling, and enemy forces were spreading across the Pacific like a plague. Back home, newspapers painted pictures of defeat after defeat, and morale was sinking faster than the battleships at Pearl Harbor. That's when Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle walked into our lives with the most audacious plan anyone had ever conceived. I first met him at Eglin Field in Florida, where we'd been training for what we thought was just another bombing mission. Doolittle was a legend, a racing pilot, an MIT graduate, and a man who'd proven that calculated risks could yield impossible results. "Gentlemen," he said, standing before our assembled crews in that hangar, "we're going to bomb Japan." The room fell silent. Someone coughed. Then Lieutenant Ted Lawson, pilot of the ruptured duck, spoke up. "Sir, with respect, how exactly do we get our bombers close enough to Japan to pull that off?" Doolittle smiled, that famous grin of his. "We're going to take off from a carrier." The laughter that followed was nervous, uncertain. B-25s weren't designed for carrier operations. They were medium bombers, built for land-based airfields with long runways. The idea of launching one from a carrier deck seemed like something out of a pulp adventure magazine. "I'm not joking," Doolittle continued. "We've calculated that a B-25 can take off from a carrier deck with a full load of fuel and bombs, but only if everything goes perfectly. There's no margin for error. None. Over the next few weeks, we trained like our lives depended on it, because they did. We practiced short takeoffs until we could get our bombers airborne in less than 500 feet. We stripped every unnecessary pound from our aircraft, replacing the bottom turret gunner with additional fuel tanks. We learned to fly at treetop level, navigating by landmarks and dead reckoning. The hardest part was accepting that this would be a one-way mission. There was no way to land a B-25 on a carrier deck. The plan was to bomb our targets in Japan, then fly west to China, where we would either land at Chinese airfields or bail out over friendly territory. If we were lucky, Chinese guerrillas would help us make it back to American lines. If we weren't, well, we tried not to think about that. On April 2, 1942, 16 B-25s were loaded onto the USS Hornet at Alameda Naval Air Station in California. The sight of those Army bombers lashed to the carrier's deck drew curious stares from the Navy personnel. Most of them didn't know what we were planning, but they knew it was something big. The Hornet sailed under the Golden Gate Bridge just after dawn, her escort of cruisers and destroyers spread out in formation around her. I stood on the flight deck, watching the California coastline fade into the morning haze, wondering if I'd ever see it again. For the next 2 weeks, we sailed west across the Pacific, staying far from the normal shipping lanes to avoid detection. The weather was miserable: gray skies, rolling seas, and a constant spray of salt water that seemed to find its way into everything. We spent our time going over the mission plans, studying target photographs, and trying to keep our bombers from being damaged by the constant motion of the ship. My crew consisted of 4 other men who had volunteered for this mission without knowing what it entailed. Lieutenant Dave Thatcher was my co-pilot, a steady hand from Montana who never seemed to lose his cool. Staff Sergeant Eldred Scott was our navigator, a former school teacher who could find his way across an ocean with nothing but a compass and a prayer. Sergeant Jacob Ironman manned our dorsal turret, while Corporal Leland Factor handled the tailgun position. We called our bomber Whiskey Pete, partly because of the initials painted on her nose, partly because we figured we'd need all the luck we could get. She was a beautiful aircraft, sleek and deadly, with twin Wright R2600 engines that could push her along at over 270 miles per hour. But she was also a heavy lady, fully loaded with fuel and 4 500-pound bombs, and getting her airborne from a carrier deck would require every bit of skill we possessed. On the morning of April 18th, we were still 650 miles from Japan when everything went wrong. I was having breakfast in the wardroom when the alarm bells started ringing. General quarters. General quarters. All hands to battle stations. The ship's intercom crackled to life. This is the captain speaking. We have been spotted by enemy patrol vessels. The mission is moving up. Army pilots report to your aircraft immediately. My stomach dropped. We were supposed to launch that afternoon when we would be only 400 miles from the Japanese coast. Now we were over 600 miles out, at the very edge of our fuel range. The extra distance meant we'd be flying on fumes by the time we reached China, if we made it that far. I grabbed my flight gear and raced up to the flight deck with my crew. The scene that greeted us was organized chaos. Navy personnel were warming up our engines, removing chocks, and making last-minute adjustments to our aircraft. The carrier was turning into the wind, her massive screws churning the water as she worked up to full speed. Doolittle's bomber, the lead aircraft, was already positioned at the stern of the flight deck. The rest of us were lined up behind him, wingtip to wingtip, with barely 3 feet of clearance on either side. There was no room for error. One mistake during takeoff, and we'd either collide with another aircraft or go straight into the ocean. "Pilots, this is Colonel Doolittle," came the voice over the radio. "The Japanese know we're here. We launch in 10 minutes. Remember your training, trust your aircraft, and give them hell." I climbed into the cockpit of Whiskey Pete, my hands shaking slightly as I ran through the pre-flight checklist. The carrier deck was pitching and rolling in the heavy seas, and I could feel the massive ship shuddering as she fought through the waves. Through the windscreen, I could see nothing but gray water and angry white foam. "How you feeling, Jack?" Thatcher asked as he settled into the co-pilot's seat. "Like I'm about to do something incredibly stupid," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "That makes 2 of us." At 0820 hours, Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 began its takeoff roll. I watched from my position 4th in line as his bomber accelerated down the deck, the carrier rising and falling beneath it like a bucking horse. For a moment, it looked like he might not make it. The aircraft seemed to hang in the air just beyond the bow, engines screaming, flaps extended, fighting for every inch of altitude. Then he was climbing, banking to the right, and disappearing into the overcast. 1 down, 15 to go. The aircraft ahead of me moved forward into takeoff position. Lieutenant Travis Hoover in the 2nd bomber made it look easy, his aircraft leaping off the deck with power to spare. Ted Lawson in the rupture duct followed, his takeoff smooth and controlled. Then it was my turn. I taxied Whiskey Pete into position at the stern of the flight deck, the yellow-shirted deck officer standing directly in front of me with his checkered flag. The engines were running at full power, the aircraft straining against the wheel chocks like a caged animal. I could feel the vibration through the seat, the instruments dancing in their mounts. The deck officer raised his flag, and I pushed the throttles forward to their stops. The right engines roared, producing every bit of their 1,700 horsepower. The aircraft shuddered and shook, eager to be airborne. I looked down the length of the flight deck, 467 feet of wooden planking between us and the ocean. In peacetime, we'd never attempt to take off in such a short distance. But these weren't peacetime conditions. The deck officer dropped his flag, and I released the brakes. Whiskey Pete lunged forward, accelerating down the deck with a violence that pressed me back into my seat. The carrier was climbing a wave, her bow pointed skyward, which would help us get airborne if we timed it right. If we timed it wrong, we launched straight into the back of the wave and disappeared beneath the surface. Airspeed 40, Thatcher called out. 50. 60. The end of the deck was rushing toward us. I could see the ocean beyond, gray and hostile, waiting to swallow us if we didn't make it. 75. 80. I pulled back on the yoke, feeling the aircraft lighten as the wings began to bite into the air. We were at the edge of the deck now, the ocean directly below us, spray from the carrier's bow wave pelting the windscreen. "We're flying," Thatcher shouted. Whiskey Pete climbed away from the carrier, her engines producing just enough power to keep us airborne. Behind us, the USS Hornet continued its turn, already preparing to launch the next bomber. I banked to the right, joining the loose formation that was assembling ahead of us. We were airborne, but the real test was just beginning. The flight to Japan took 4.5 hours, most of it at an altitude of less than 200 feet above the water. We flew in loose formation, spread out across several miles to avoid detection, our bombers skimming the wave tops like giant albatrosses. The weather was miserable, low clouds, occasional rain showers, and a headwind that seemed determined to push us back toward the carrier. Every few minutes, Scott would give me a new heading, trying to compensate for the wind drift and stay on course for our target. "How's our fuel looking?" I asked Thatcher during our third hour of flight. "Not great," he replied, tapping the fuel gauges. "We're burning more than we planned because of this headwind. We might have enough to reach the target, but getting to China is going to be tight." I nodded, trying not to think about the alternatives. If we ran out of fuel over the ocean, we'd have to ditch in the frigid waters of the North Pacific. If we made it to Japan but couldn't continue to China, we'd have to bail out over enemy territory. Neither option was particularly appealing. As we approached the Japanese coast, the weather began to clear. Through breaks in the clouds, I could see the green islands of the Japanese archipelago spread out below us. It was beautiful country, peaceful and serene, giving no hint of the war machine that had brought so much destruction to the Pacific. "There's the coast," Scott announced over the intercom. "Right on schedule." I looked ahead and saw the shoreline of Japan, our first glimpse of enemy territory. We were about to do something that no one had ever done before bombed the Japanese home islands. The psychological impact would be enormous, but first we had to survive the next hour. We crossed the Japanese coast at 12:15 hours, still flying at low altitude to avoid detection. The countryside below was a patchwork of rice paddies and small villages, with roads and railways threading between the hills. It looked incredibly peaceful, almost pastoral. "Fighters!" Airmen suddenly shouted from the dorsal turret. "Zeros, 2 o'clock high." I looked up and saw 3 Japanese fighters diving toward us, their wings already sparkling with muzzle flashes. The Zero was a formidable opponent, fast, maneuverable, and flown by some of the best pilots in the world. Our only advantage was surprise and the fact that we were flying so low the Japanese couldn't get a good angle of attack. "Hold on," I shouted, pushing the nose down until we were barely 50 feet above the rice paddies. The fighters overshot us, pulling up sharply to avoid hitting the ground. "They're coming around for another pass," Factor called from the tailgun position. I threw the bomber into a series of violent S-turns, staying as low as possible, using the terrain to break up their attack runs. The Zeros were fast, but they were having trouble getting lined up for a clean shot. After several passes, they gave up and climbed away, probably low on fuel. "Good work, everyone," I said, leveling off and checking our heading. "Scott, how far to the target?" "About 20 minutes, assuming we don't run into any more fighters." We continued inland, following railways and roads toward Tokyo. The landscape was changing now, becoming more urban, with larger towns and industrial areas. Smokestacks and factory buildings appeared below us, evidence of Japan's industrial might. At 13:30 hours, we reached the outskirts of Tokyo. The city stretched out before us, a vast urban sprawl of wooden buildings and narrow streets. It was enormous, far larger than any American city I'd ever seen, with millions of people going about their daily lives, completely unaware that American bombers were approaching their capital. Our target was the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries plant in the Nagoya district, a facility that manufactured aircraft engines for the Japanese military. Intelligence reports indicated it was heavily defended with anti-aircraft guns and fighter patrols, but we'd been briefed to expect that. Target in sight, Scott announced. Bearing 090, distance 5 miles. I could see the factory complex ahead, a large industrial building surrounded by smaller structures with railway lines running alongside. Smoke was rising from several chimneys, indicating the plant was in full operation. Bomb bay doors coming open, Thatcher reported. Bombs armed and ready. The factory was growing larger in the windscreen. I could see people in the streets below, some of them looking up at us, probably wondering what an American bomber was doing over their city. In a few seconds, they would have their answer. Steady, steady. Scott called out from the navigator's position, his eye pressed to the bomb site. Bomb bay doors open. Bombs away. I felt the aircraft lurch upward as the 4 500-pound bombs dropped from the bomb bay. Below us, the factory buildings grew larger in the windscreen for a moment, then began to fall away as we climbed and banked to the left. Direct hit. Airmen shouted from the dorsal turret. The whole place is going up. I looked back and saw flames and smoke rising from the factory complex. Our bombs had found their mark, and the industrial facility was burning fiercely. It was a small blow in the grand scheme of the war, but it was a blow struck at the heart of the Japanese Empire. Good work, everyone, I said over the intercom. Now let's get out of here before they send up the whole Japanese Air Force. Getting out of Tokyo was harder than getting in. The Japanese were fully alert now, with air raid sirens wailing across the city and anti-aircraft guns opening up from dozens of positions. Black puffs of flak burst around us as we flew at maximum speed toward the coast, the aircraft shaking from the concussion of nearby explosions. Fighters climbing to intercept, Factor called from the tailgun position. Looks like a whole squadron of them. I pushed the throttles forward, coaxing every bit of speed from the right engines. The B-25 wasn't built for speed, but she was tough, and right now toughness was what we needed. The fighters were climbing fast, but we had a head start and the advantage of surprise. There's the coast, Thatcher announced. We're almost out of here. The Pacific Ocean appeared ahead of us, blue and welcoming after the hostile territory we'd just crossed. But we weren't safe yet. The Japanese fighters were still pursuing, and we had over 1,000 miles to fly before we reached friendly territory. As we crossed the coastline, I looked back at the Japanese mainland. Smoke was rising from several locations where the other bombers had struck their targets. The Doolittle raid was a success, but the cost was yet to be determined. Set course for China, I told Scott, and pray we have enough fuel to get there. The flight from Japan to China was a nightmare of navigation and fuel management. We flew at low altitude to avoid detection, using every bit of cover the terrain could provide. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with thick clouds and intermittent rain showers that made navigation almost impossible. I'm not sure exactly where we are, Scott admitted after several hours of flying. The cloud cover is too thick to get a good celestial fix, and we've been blown off course by the wind. Our fuel situation was becoming critical. The extra distance from the carrier launch point, combined with the headwinds and the high-speed escape from Tokyo, had burned more fuel than we'd planned. The gauges showed we were running on fumes. How much further to the Chinese coast? I asked. Maybe an hour, maybe 2, Scott replied. It's hard to tell without a good position fix. It did the math in my head. We had perhaps 30 minutes of fuel remaining, maybe 40 if we leaned the mixture to the point where the engines were barely running. It was going to be close. We might have to bail out, I told the crew. Make sure your chutes are ready. The thought of jumping out of the aircraft over enemy territory was terrifying, but it was better than riding the bomber into the ground when the engines quit. We'd been briefed on survival procedures, but the reality was that if we went down in Japanese-occupied China, our chances of making it back to American lines were slim. Darkness fell as we continued west, the fuel gauges now reading empty. The engines were still running, but I could hear them beginning to miss and stumble as they sucked the last drops of fuel from the tanks. There, Thatcher suddenly shouted, pointing ahead. Lights. It's got to be China. I looked where he was pointing and saw a scattering of lights in the distance, a city or a large town, definitely inhabited. Whether it was Chinese or Japanese occupied, we'd have to take our chances. Get ready to bail out, I ordered. We're not going to make it much further. The left engine coughed and died, the propeller windmilling in the slipstream. The aircraft lurched to the left, and I fought to keep it level as we continued on one engine. The remaining engine was running around, missing badly, and I knew it wouldn't last much longer. Everyone out, I shouted. Go! 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 Scott went first, disappearing through the bottom hatch. Airmen and Factor followed, their parachutes deploying in the darkness below. Thatcher hesitated, looking back at me. I'm staying with the aircraft, I told him. Maybe I can find a place to set her down. Like hell you are, he replied, grabbing my arm. We're all in this together. The right engine coughed and died, and suddenly we were flying a 30,000-pound glider in the darkness over enemy territory. The controls went slack as we lost hydraulic pressure, and I knew we had perhaps 2 minutes before we hit the ground. Now, I shouted, pushing Thatcher toward the hatch. We have to go now. We jumped together, falling through the cold night air as Whiskey Pete continued her final glide into the darkness. My parachute opened with a jerk, and I found myself floating down through the rain toward the invisible ground below. I hit the ground hard, rolling through what felt like a rice paddy, my parachute dragging me through the mud and water. For several minutes, I lay still, listening for sounds of pursuit. In the distance, I could hear voices, Chinese voices, speaking in rapid, excited tones. American, American, someone called out in broken English. I struggled to my feet, still tangled in my parachute lines. A group of Chinese peasants appeared out of the darkness, their faces barely visible in the dim starlight. They were pointing at me and chattering excitedly, but I couldn't tell if they were friendly or hostile. One of them, an elderly man with a wispy beard, approached me cautiously. American? He asked in heavily accented English. Yes, I replied. American pilot. Japanese. Boom boom, I said, making an explosion gesture with my hands. The old man's face broke into a wide grin. Good, good. Japanese no good. He turned to the others and spoke rapidly in Chinese. They began to smile and nod, and I realized I had landed among friends. Over the next several hours, the Chinese villagers helped me locate the rest of my crew. We had all landed within a few miles of each other, and miraculously, none of us had been seriously injured. The villagers fed us, gave us dry clothes, and began making arrangements to move us to safety. The Japanese are looking for you, our guide explained through a translator. But we know the mountains. We will take you to the American soldiers. The journey back to American lines took 3 weeks. We traveled by night, hiding in caves and abandoned buildings during the day, moving through the mountainous terrain of central China with the help of Chinese guerrillas and American missionaries. It was a difficult journey, made more dangerous by the fact that the Japanese were conducting massive search operations for the downed American airmen. We learned later that they had captured 8 of our fellow raiders, executing 3 of them and imprisoning the others for the duration of the war. But we also learned that our mission had been a stunning success. All 16 bombers had reached Japan and delivered their bombs on target. The psychological impact on the Japanese was enormous. If American bombers could reach Tokyo, then no part of the Japanese empire was safe. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered. More importantly, the raid had given America something it desperately needed: hope. After months of defeat and retreat, American forces had struck back at the heart of the Japanese empire. The newspapers were full of headlines about the Doolittle Raiders and their daring attack on Tokyo. When we finally reached American lines in late May, we were flown back to the United States as heroes. President Roosevelt personally decorated Jimmy Doolittle with the Medal of Honor, and the entire crew received distinguished flying crosses. As I write this story more than 70 years later, I'm struck by how young and naive we were. We thought we were invincible, that our courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. In many ways, we were right. The Doolittle raid proved that audacity and innovation could achieve the impossible. But we also learned that victory comes at a price. Of the 80 men who flew on that mission, 3 were killed in action, 8 were captured and tortured by the Japanese, and several others were wounded. The Chinese paid an even higher price. The Japanese retaliated against the civilian population that had helped us, killing an estimated 250,000 people in reprisal raids. The Doolittle raid was a turning point in the Pacific War. It forced the Japanese to divert resources to homeland defense, and it set the stage for the great American offensive that would ultimately lead to victory. But more than that, it proved that Americans could adapt, innovate, and fight back when the odds seemed impossible. When I climbed into the cockpit of Whiskey Pete on that gray morning in April 1942, I thought I was just another pilot flying another mission. I had no idea that I was about to participate in one of the most audacious military operations in history, or that our small group of Army Air Force crews would change the course of the war. The 16 B-25s that launched from the USS Hornet that day carried more than just bombs. They carried the hopes and dreams of a nation that had been bloodied but not beaten. They carried the message that America would not surrender, would not give up, and would fight back no matter how long the odds. That message was delivered with devastating effectiveness. The Japanese may have awakened a sleeping giant at Pearl Harbor, but at Tokyo, they learned that the giant was now wide awake and ready to fight. The thunder that rolled across Tokyo on April 18, 1942, was the sound of American resolve. It was the sound of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. It was the sound of victory, still distant, but now inevitable. And it was the sound that would echo across the Pacific for the next 3 years, until the last Japanese surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, bringing the war full circle from that first desperate mission to bomb the heart of the Japanese Empire. We called ourselves the Doolittle Raiders, and we changed the world.